Hello, this is Derek Taylor for HIST 141, U.S. History since 1877. This is my lecture on the Reconstruction era in the United States history, the attempt to put the country back together at the end of the Civil War, which I'm titling Nation, in parentheses, Rebuilding. And as you're going to see, if there, the first class talked about how I see this in terms of nation building and how I see Reconstruction as part of that. And so let's get started. Let's get into this lecture to go along with your readings for this week. And you begin, your textbook begins with a story about African Americans. We'll get to this in a second, but the aftermath of the war for the country as a whole is completely unprecedented. A war in which estimates somewhere about 700,000 people now died in the war. The South, much of the South lay in ruins because it had been destroyed during the war. The North had decided to go attacking railroad lines and stuff like this at the end of the war. So it's in a shambles. And 5 days after the surrender at Appomattox of Robert E. Lee, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer. So you're in a really wildly unique situation politically, legally. How are the Confederate States going to be rejoined in the Union? What are we going to do with former slaves? There are millions of people now who had once been, literally, if you can imagine it, defined at law as personal property. Now they're to be, well, that's the question: free citizens, equal citizens. And with all this, is the question: how do you heal the divisions of the war itself that caused it? The war itself exacerbated. Lincoln, in his secular inaugural address, wanted to have a settlement with, as he called it, quote, with malice toward none, unquote. But things weren't necessarily. It was a real difficult situation. And of course, many, as you're going to see, maybe most Southerners did not necessarily didn't want a Reconstruction that included African Americans, partly because, of course, of obviously racism, but also because they didn't want to live under what they regarded as a foreign occupation. In fact, it's a weird fact. Some 10,000 former Confederate soldiers fled the country, including high-ranking Confederate officers, and settled in places like Brazil, or served with the British or the French and even Egyptian armies abroad. So you had a real powerful sense of, okay, we lost the war, but what's the peace going to be like? The second thing I'm going to mention here real briefly, I'll get to going forward, is that I call this lecture Nation Building because the country was still in the process, territorially speaking, of becoming what it is today before the war. The process of nation building, of the whole idea of the settlement of the continent with manifest destiny, that you're going to, you're destined to take over territories which are occupied by Native Americans, which they're fighting the Plains Indians during the Civil War. The Union Army is fighting wars with Indian tribes while they're fighting the South during the war. And even then, there are bitter divisions about the war in the North during the war itself. What makes Reconstruction unique is that this nation building takes place in a situation in which one group, Republicans, one party, and particularly the most radical among them, have an opportunity to create a single unified nation using federal power, to use the South as it were as sort of a laboratory for creating a unified nationalized state, and to make that society more, I'm using this in quotation marks, quote unquote, democratic. And that's something we're going to see was a plan the Republicans had even during the war. They thought the war had happened partly because the South was so different economically speaking. And they wanted to make the country one economy so that it would function as one. They thought those divisions are what had caused the war. And so it sets the stage for the beginnings of something like a modern nation state as we understand it. So that's the story I'm telling here. And of course, in your textbook will go over some of this yourself. You have to understand there was not one unified view of how the nation should be put together at the end of the war. Abraham Lincoln had wanted to have a fairly lenient policy. His so-called 10% plan basically allowed any state, any former Confederate state, when 10% of its voters had taken an oath to the Constitution and abolish slavery, that the state would be readmitted, along with everyone getting a general amnesty except the most high-ranking Confederates. During the war, they offered this to the South during the war. They rebuffed it with the idea that, they're still fighting the war to the bitter end. As the war drew to a close, the Republicans in Congress, remember during the Civil War, there's nothing but Republicans in Congress. Basically, all the Democrats, for the most part, are in the South. They pass a bill called the Wade-Davis bill, which is much more strict, which permanently disenfranchises most Confederate leaders. It's much more punitive in that regard. Lincoln vetoes this bill, and in fact, there's this tension because it's so unprecedented. Nobody knows, which branch of government is responsible for readmitting states who've left the Union. I'll give you a hint. If you go look in the Constitution, there's nothing in there, and so Lincoln thought of this as being his prerogative as president, because at that point they were still dealing with what they considered a foreign power, and the president's responsible for foreign policy. After his assassination, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, comes into the presidency. He has a much different idea, even more lenient than Lincoln. And Johnson's kind of an interesting person. Let me say this up front. When I say interesting, I don't mean good. He's a war Democrat who served. He was a Democrat from Tennessee who served with the Union. He's a Unionist. And he was clearly, by the way, people use this term in metaphor, I think in ways they shouldn't these days. He was a literal white supremacist. He did not think blacks were equal. He wanted to keep them unequal. But he sided with the North partly for class reasons. Johnson was a poor white Southerner, came from the lower classes, essentially, in the South. And he detested the slave owners, the big landowning families who ran the South. He saw himself as a champion of farmers and laborers, and so he became a member of the Union during the war. And yet, after Lincoln's death, his plan was to offer amnesty to all Southerners except high-ranking Confederate officials and wealthy property owners, again, whom he despised, as long as they took an oath of allegiance to the Constitution. He took on his own authority the step of appointing governors for all the southern states. And basically, the only conditions for this were revoking their ordinances of secession, repudiating their Confederate debts, and ratifying the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. Within a few months, most states had all the former Confederate states had met these requirements. And what this does, this is a very crucial turning point, because early on, in the immediate aftermath of the surrender at Appomattox, there was real despair in the South about what was going to happen. They were afraid of retribution. And what modern historians think is, if the Congress, if the president had been sort of united, they could have imposed a much more stringent settlement on the South and probably protected African Americans better than they actually did in retrospect. But as soon as Johnson started offering this amnesty, the Southerners got the idea, hey, this isn't going to be that bad. And so they started in the next few years passing what were called black codes. Black codes are laws designed effectively to prevent freed slaves from having any civil rights, restricting their rights to or impeding their rights to vote, to assemble. As you'll see, the examples in your major problems reader of this, black codes from Louisiana, which restrict all sorts of things that are in the First Amendment. They're effectively ways of driving ex-slaves back to plantations and making them back into laborers who work for whites again. And in fact, you're going to have at the same time, again, this tension bubbling up between Johnson and his Republican Congress. Johnson actually commissioned a report about a state of the South and the prospects for Reconstruction. And he sent a man named General Carl Schurz on a tour of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi to gather evidence on the state of Southern opinion. And he shelved Schurz's report to the Senate. And the reason why is his message was something he didn't want to hear. Basically, that only the application of tremendous, overwhelming federal force could get the South to accept Reconstruction. And despite the fact he hated the Southern plantation elite, he was still a white supremacist. And so he shelved the report, was rescued about 100 years later by modern historians who liked the idea. Because what Schurz was calling for, just to give you an idea, Schurz was calling for something like a social revolution in the South, using the power of the federal government to reshape Southern society from top to bottom. Very radical. Schurz, by the way, is a German. He was actually from Germany. He was a revolutionary himself. He'd fought there were revolutions in Germany in 1848, all of them unsuccessful. And he emigrated to the United States before the Civil War. And so he already had these ideas in his head before he got to the United States. In any event, you have this showdown between the Congress and the president. They start blocking Johnson's desires for Reconstruction. They start passing, because you have all of a sudden with the passing of the Black Code, you have a wave of violence against African Americans in the South. And Republicans concluded that the South was actively blocking application of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. So they extended the life of the Freedmen's Bureau, which Lincoln had put into effect, a bureau which basically helped African Americans get on their feet, that sort of thing, get started, and make it, basically give it federal funding for the first time, make it permanent, or as permanent as they can. And they started passing bills. They passed the Civil Rights Bill, granting equal citizens to former slaves. Johnson vetoed this bill. And then they basically went and passed another one over his veto in 1866. And so they also proposed the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which was supposed to ratify civil rights for African Americans, which got ratified in 1868. And so you have this this showdown, which leads to Congress overriding Johnson and turning it into a radical plan to reshape the South. In 1867, the Reconstruction Act, they pass over his veto, basically carves up the South into military districts, 5 military districts, all under the command of a general. Remember, Johnson wanted to do this through provisional governors, again, civilian rule. They're basically putting them under martial law. They make the price for reigning the Union to give the vote to freedmen, and to completely and utterly disenfranchise the South's pre-war political class. Johnson tried to veto it, didn't work. This led to a blowup over Johnson. He tried to suspend one of his cabinet members, who was was a radical Republican. He tried to dismiss him from office, and in retaliation for this, in 1868, he's impeached, or he's put up on an impeachment vote by House Republicans. They vote to impeach him. He barely gets off in the Senate. Does Johnson? He falls one vote short of the 2/3 majority, and so he's not tried. But he's basically left powerless to alter the course of things. In any case, in 1868, Grant, Ulysses Grant, the former hero of the Civil War, gets elected. He overwhelmingly wins. The Republicans sweep the congressional elections. They have a free hand now. And so they pass in 1868 the 14th Amendment, and they propose and get another amendment to the Constitution passed, the 15th, which forbade either the federal or government or the states the right to deny the right to citizens right to vote based on the basis of race, color, or, quote, previous condition of servitude. In other words, freed slaves could be denied the right to vote. Eventually passes and becomes part of the Constitution in 1870. And this is kind of a major feat for Reconstruction. It's a major effort to try and give African Americans the right to have, civil rights, the right to be free citizens. When you think about it, and basically, yeah. So it's the amazing thing. And during Reconstruction, you'll have thousands of African Americans, freed slaves, go to the polls as a result. Here's just a couple of images from your textbook. This is Harper's Weekly's magazine. It's still in existence, but this is meant to be a cartoon, as you can kind of see, depicting the South's refusal to go along with giving voting rights, obviously, to African Americans. You can see the title there is "We Accept the Situation." They obviously do not, which they did not, right? And if you're, again, we don't want to take their perspective, but if you're trying to understand why the South, Southerners wouldn't just go along with this, they accepted the fact they were defeated. Grant actually did a tour of the South just after the war, and I'm misremembering the exact quotation, but he said somewhere that he thought that most Southerners believed that they had appealed to the highest court available, meaning God himself, in battle, and lost, and they accepted the defeat. They didn't accept anything. They accepted the fact they had to be part of the United States again. They didn't accept the idea that they had to be equal in any way with African Americans. And of course, again, this is being done to them, what seems like to them still an occupying force. A foreign army is forcing them to do this. So you're being told at the point of a gun that people you've always viewed as totally inferior to you are now equal to you, and you're going to have to compete for jobs with them. You're going to have to compete for status with them. Again, this is all bad, but that is at least the point. I think the point of view where they're coming from there, where you get this sort of attitude and things go on here. And just a map to show you again how much this is. Again, I made the parallel in my little intro first class to nation building. Again, the entire South is treated like a sort of occupied territory. Again, not unlike what the United States would do later on in places like Germany and Japan after World War II. And you can see the dates in which they're readmitted into the Union, but again, carved up by military force. And finally, just a note here, just a note about how much these things, like the passage of these amendments, meant to African Americans. You can kind of see this poster here celebrating that 15th Amendment. You see a wedding down there. You see them. I think this is probably them signing the bill, I guess, there, but you have them celebrating these sorts of things. Again, these things meant life to the freed slaves. They were going to have, legal freedom for the first time. So clashing differences of opinion about Reconstruction. And especially with regards to the emancipation itself. That actually should say emancipation in global perspective. Sorry about that. My apologies. One thing to note about this is just how unique this was, this Reconstruction era. Emancipation of slaves was not unique to the United States in the 19th century. The British Empire had freed its slaves in the 1830s. And so you had, this had happened before. It had left colonies like Jamaica and South Africa divided between white elites and poor Black laborers. And so you're going to have, similar things going on. In fact, there was a rebellion in Jamaica in 1865 as emancipation got started. And some of this were black laborers rose up to protest white policies. Southerners actually heard about this and followed it at the time. And so this is one of the things, they heard stories of blacks massacring whites. It's one of the things that made them so adamantly against Reconstruction. But in fact, American Reconstruction was much more radical than anything else in the 19th century. Because blacks would achieve full voting rights, at least during the time the Union Army occupied the South. Something was denied them in British colonies. And so it's something that's taking place in other parts of the world. It's not exactly slavery. In 1861, the Russian Tsar emancipates serfs who were bound to the land in the Russian Empire. So it's part of a wider a wider end of the slave trade, and it has affinities. This becomes about because of a military occupation. In the 19th century, the British and the French try to end the slave trade in Africa through force, essentially. So it goes along with this. But despite being, a singular event here, you are talking about a very the thing about Reconstruction, when you learn about it, is there are all these different goals. Everybody has their own goals in all this. The Republicans in the North, the ex-Confederates, uh, even among Republicans, the radical Republicans are really different, as I'll explain in a second, than your average Republican. And then, of course, you have the African Americans themselves, the freed slaves. You're going to have, differing goals. What the North wanted, what a lot of Northern politicians wanted, was to create a wage working economy in the South. They want to turn freedmen into, you know, laborers, paid laborers. And this is different. This is a problem for a lot of these free slaves. They wanted land. A lot of them assumed, a lot of them probably were told by the military in the aftermath of the war, they were going to get some of their slave owners' former land. Hey, they'd worked on it, right? So they should get some. And you had, blacks roaming the countryside, looking, going into cities and stuff like this, trying to escape their former masters. So it's a real chaotic situation initially. And in fact, if you don't know, of course, when he went through the South at the end of the war, General Tecumseh Sherman of the Union Army went around promising freedmen, 40 acres and a mule is the phrase. So you have this, but again, you have these conflicting goals here. They wanted land. That's all they knew, by the way, was farming, most of them. But Republicans wanted to restore cotton as the country's leading export. And they weren't really, there was no stomach for expropriating the land of former slaveholders to get them to do this. Few states did anything to help freedmen purchase land. And so most of them were left very economically vulnerable at the end of the war. Meanwhile, landowners in the South tried to retain the old gang labor system with wages replacing things like food and clothing slaves once received. And eventually you had the development of sharecropping as a system of labor for cotton agriculture, in which, again, it kind of reproduces in a lot of ways the effects of slavery. And so you're going to have a lot of ex-slaves going back to the old farms they actually worked on. Even then, as bad as it was still preferable to laboring for their to being slaves. But it was pretty devastating to the South as a whole as an economy. It committed the South again inflexibly to one cash crop, basically. So it was bad overall and bad in many ways for the African Americans. One good thing about all of this, despite some of the vicissitudes of Reconstruction, is that African Americans were allowed to build their own communities openly for the first time. And you had a lot of missionaries, teachers coming from the North, mostly white, but also some free blacks from the North coming down during Reconstruction, helping build things like churches, schools, other institutions that become the center of life for these freed African Americans in the South. And in many ways, this was very successful. These missionaries facilitated a pretty remarkable increase in Black literacy over the period in question. I think the notes I have here, 5% of freedmen were literate in 1870. Some 70% were by 1900. And so you're going to begin to build real communities, stable communities in some ways for the first times. But even here again, you're going to have differences of opinion between, Northerners who, again, they come down. Sometimes they take a little bit of a superior attitude to the people they're helping, as it often happens. And Southern blacks who have their own ideas about how to work, how to worship, how to live. And so you're going to have this, but you are going to have them doing good things. Missionaries, the American Missionary Association, for example, an abolitionist society that existed before the war, helped found a number of 11 Black colleges in the South, including universities like Howard University and Fisk University. So, and you will have, when you get to the talking about Republican governments in the South themselves, because you're going to have these governments where effectively, Southern former Confederates are disenfranchised, and therefore African Americans are going to have a big say in elections under these Republican governments. You're going to have elected African Americans coming into positions of authority for the first time. You'll have some attempts, by the way, to promote things like integration of public facilities. It's a touchy issue, though, and most blacks were actually okay with some sort of separation for a lot of reasons. There was a civil rights bill passed by Congress in 1875 that was fairly narrow in terms of its reach. And as you're going to see, eventually it's going to be undermined by the Supreme Court. But you do have efforts to change things and improve their lives. And in fact, you're going to have the Freedmen's Bureau help freedmen get on their feet, economically speaking, and help establish schools for African Americans. You're also going to have a series of programs enacted by governments in the South, Reconstruction governments, building of things like hospitals, better roads, better revival of the railroad networks, more humane prison systems, asylums, stuff like this. And in fact, modern historians tend to, some of them anyway, have tended to laud the achievements, like this, progressive achievements in terms of education, for example. By 1875, over half of Black children were attending school in several deep Southern states, and even poor white children benefited from this. So again, we tend to think of it, as we'll get to in a moment, of this being a complete failure. Modern historians want to see some positives in Reconstruction, and in particular see the freedmen and these communities of freed slaves taking initiative and having some agency for themselves. And just to give you an idea here, this is a map of a master's house and a slave quarters, the Barrow Plantation from 1860, before the Civil War. Just to give you an idea, you see the plantation boundary is, you see where everything is at. You can see what this looks like in 1881. And you can see how little has actually changed is what's going on here. And again, in the aftermath of the Civil War, again, most Blacks didn't have things like education. They have a lot of, opportunities to do anything else. And so a lot of them were sort of, left without much choice to go back to the farms they had once worked on as slaves. This leads into that system, which is very iniquitous for them, of sharecropping. You can kind of see this image of sharecroppers in Georgia, a Black family there, a couple of kids. This could be mother and father, it could be a grandfather, it could be extended family. And you see the white owner that actually owns the land, the back, the system where he owns the land, they work it essentially. So then there's an image of the Fisk Jubilee Singers. This is a choir, a famous choir, started at Fisk University in Nashville during Reconstruction period. Still around today, if I'm not mistaken. So again, you did have some opportunities for African Americans to advance themselves as a result of Reconstruction. This is a picture of the First Baptist Church of Richmond, Virginia. This is one of the sort of centers of life in Richmond, Virginia for freed African Americans. Becomes important. The church becomes the center of life, basically, in the South for freed Blacks during Reconstruction. So how does all this come undone? Well, a couple of things. One is that the Republican Party in the North by the 1870s is beginning to kind of come apart at the seams. First thing is there's a global economic crisis in the 1870s, where you have, prices of crops fall, manufacturing falls off. And all this is caused, by the way, by a bunch of railroads in the United States going bankrupt. Construction of new railways stopping. Remember, you had this big rush to complete the Transcontinental Railroad after the Civil War. A lot of these railroad companies were, well, I'll get to this in a second, they were really corrupt and taking money from the government. And in general, Republican policies became too expensive for a lot of people in the North. And with the economic downturn globally, both Northern investors, but also foreign investors from places like Britain, no longer wanted to invest to ensure the reforms they were starting in the South. Other events sort of led the Republicans to sort of back down from all this. Charles Sumner, who'd been the leader of the radical Republicans in the Senate, dies in 1874. You have a series of scandals that hits the Grant administration, such as the Credit Mobilier scandal. This is, again, the railroad stuff. The Union Pacific Railroad shareholders had set up a fake corporation to profit from grants from the federal government. This came to light. There's a bunch of other ones. And this all eroded public confidence in Grant's and policies, particularly during his second term in office. And then you just had corruption everywhere in industries, which touched Reconstruction. There were failure of a lot of saving and loans companies during Reconstruction. Among them, ones like the Freeman's Savings and Trust Company, which again was created to fund things like churches and charities in the South, and it collapsed. And so all this signals just a sort of a lack of will on the part of the public to pay for this anymore. And they're also, of course, hearing nothing but reports of violence, and there's lots of violence. We'll get to this in a second in the South, and all filtered, by the way, through pretty racist views of African Americans, even in the North. I should mention this if this doesn't. If you don't recognize this, even though they freed the slaves, wanted them to have equal rights, a lot of the people in the North, they were still in our terms definitely what you'd call racist. They thought of them as being inferior, even if they should be legally given legal rights. They didn't see themselves as being equal. And after a while, I guess the modern term for this is compassion fatigue. They got tired of trying to care about it and do something about it. Plus, you had members of the Republican Party break away in 1872 and try to form their own party. The Liberal Republican Party. These are classical liberals. If you don't know what that term means, it means lots of things today. That term's changing, but basically it meant modern sort of economic conservative Republicans are today. Classical liberals are people who believe in free trade, small government, those sorts of things. They got wiped out at the polls in 1872, but still, it's the end to the sort of unified front the Republicans had through most of Reconstruction. But as big a deal as anything else are the actions of white Southerners. Again, you had former ex-Confederates who've been excluded in some ways from some of these state constitutions, basically forming political coalitions with business owners, professionals, wealthy landowners to help politically overthrow the Reconstruction governments. They called themselves redeemers. They were going to redeem the South from its loss in the Civil War. This includes, of course, not just political doing this, but of course, paramilitary, what amounts to insurgency, violence against both freedmen, but also against some of their Northern supporters. Most famously, the Ku Klux Klan appears in Tennessee in 1866 under the leadership of Nathan Bedford Forrest, ex-Confederate general. And by 1870, the Klan is operating pretty much everywhere in the South as an armed wing of the Democratic Party, basically. Think of it like the IRA in Ireland during the Troubles, if you know what that is. And so between 1869 and 1871, Congress attempted to suppress the Klan through legislation known as the enforcement laws. And if you're wondering what they did, as I'm sure you know, the Klan liked to wear masks to hide who they were. They actually passed anti-masking laws. You couldn't wear these hoods so they could find out who you were, ironically enough. And they eventually did round up a lot of these Klansmen. After 1872, prosecutions began to drop off, began to have less and less success. But it demonstrated where they didn't have the backing of federal force, Reconstruction governments just didn't have any legitimacy. And in fact, you're going to have massive resistance throughout the South. Between 1873 and 1875, Democrats will overthrow Republican governments in Texas, Alabama, and Arkansas. In Mississippi, armed local Democrats went to the polls and paraded and stuffed ballot boxes, taking control of the state there in 1875. In 1876, the violence between ex-Confederates and freedmen and Union supporters was so bad, U.S. troops had to be called in to stop the violence. And the Republican Party began to suffer political losses in the South. Grant eventually pulled the troops out of South Carolina because he just didn't want to do it anymore. And by 1876, virtually every Republican Reconstruction government was gone except for Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. Everywhere else, Democrats, who were made up of former Confederates, had taken back control. And then finally, through a series of Supreme Court cases in the 1870s and 80s, the Supreme Court undermined the effect of the 14th Amendment, which was supposed to guarantee the basic rights of African Americans. Long story short, the court didn't think the federal government had a right to determine what the states did in terms of voting laws. They said those are state matters. We're not going to interfere. And this effectively subverted any chance of actually guaranteeing equal rights for African Americans going forward. And then finally, by 1876, there's an election. You have a disputed election between the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and the Democrat Samuel Tilden. Tilden won the popular vote. The Democrats claimed there was voting fraud in Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana, the only states still ruled by Reconstruction governments. And the Republicans called all three states as electoral victories for Hayes, the Republican candidate. And so what happened was the Democrats claimed they had won it. And so Congress had two sets of electoral votes, electoral college votes for those states. So when they met in 1877, Congress had to decide who won those states and therefore who won the presidency. What they did is that when Congress, according to the Constitution, regulated its own elections, so Congress, which was controlled by Republicans, appointed an electoral commission made up of 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. The commission awarded those electoral college votes to Hayes by a vote of 8-7. At this point, the Democrats, upset about this, began stalling a final count of votes for several days. However, on March 1st of that year, they ended their tactics and Hayes was inaugurated. In exchange for this, Hayes withdrew the last troops from the South, and eventually the last of the Reconstruction governments were done away with. And so gone were, African Americans, holding public office, voting rates plummeted everywhere. And the South was governed by Democrats, mostly white Democrats, obviously, until the 1960s and 70s and the Civil Rights Movement as a result. And so Reconstruction more or less ended in failure. Here, a couple more images. This is, I don't know which publication this is from, but you can kind of see this is a mockery of Grant's, his corruption. Obviously, he's on this gymnastic thing here with his mouth, a thing that says corruption in his mouth, holding up his cronies down here. And they're calling it Grantism, I guess is the title of this cartoon. And here's just a picture of Nathan Bedford Forrest, ex-Confederate, Confederate general, founder of the Ku Klux Klan. You can see what a miserable looking guy he is. Again, one of these ex-Confederates who successfully, as an insurgency, fought off the efforts of Reconstruction. And finally, that brings me to the end here, and we'll talk a little bit about, okay, we have to ask the question. I'm talking about historiography here. If you don't know what that word means, that just means, historiography just means what modern historians have written about earlier events. History about historical events and what they've said and what their opinions are. And no one disagrees that Reconstruction was anything but a failure. However, why did it fail? Well, that's changed over the years. There have been different schools of interpretation. For a long time, from the late 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, people followed the interpretation of what's called the Dunning schools, named by a man named William Dunning, who was a historian, I believe, at Princeton University. And this is the idea that Northerners, carpetbaggers, went south to make money off the South. Republican governors who were corrupt, freed slaves who were wanting to take revenge on their former masters, caused the failure of Reconstruction. They had undermined, what should have been a more harmonious settlement. And this idea that it was the Republican governments, primarily it was their fault, was fed by racist attitudes. Again, even among historians who at places like Princeton and the Ivy League in the 19th and 20th centuries. And they saw Reconstruction as largely an immoral imposition on conquered Southerners. This is going to get revised heavily. In fact, the other major interpretation of this is sometimes called the revisionist interpretation. And this comes about in the 1960s for obvious reasons, because of the social changes of the 1960s, the civil rights movement. You have historians going back and looking with fresh eyes at the sources for all this. And one of the things they immediately refuted was the idea that, the Dunning School said was that, well, Southerners would have accepted Reconstruction if it hadn't been for, all these carpetbaggers, Republican governors, corrupt Republican politicians, and so on and so forth. They refuted that idea. They established pretty definitively that almost nobody in the South was going to accept being on a level of legal and social equality with freed slaves. And in fact, they like to stress the achievements of Reconstruction's governments in the South. Again, they're the ones who, in the 1960s, people like Eric Foner, contend that these were progressive governments, right? Eyeing reform and things like education and law and stuff like this. And again, this is 1960s. Most of these historians are very much people of the left. Eric Foner is definitely a leftist. And he's the one, by the way, who sort of resurrected that report by Carl Schurz, because he likes the idea of the federal government using federal power to reshape the country to make it more equal for African Americans, which is what, of course, the civil rights movement in the 60s wound up doing. And then finally, there's been slight changes since. There's a post-revisionist interpretation of Reconstruction, which says that it generally agrees with the revisionist, however, is less sure about their achievements. Basically sees this, and I think Foner's the one who said this, as an unfinished revolution. In other words, it was a revolution that didn't quite go far enough, and there's some of these people see the civil rights movement as a continuation of that in the 1960s. Another way people have seen this, and this is the way I've constructed this lecture, is Reconstruction as nation building. Some historians have taken up this idea that the pacification of the South is the first of the U.S. ventures into nation building, which they'll do in places like the Philippines. Again, I mentioned Japan and Germany already. The idea that the United States wants to remake the world into a capitalist, democratic, socially progressive society like itself. And it also sees, of course, because of all the fighting that goes on in Reconstruction, Reconstruction is basically a continuation of military intervention that started during the war. And the comparisons are obvious when you think about it. Just think about the insurgencies in Iraq, in other places like that during the last 20 years. That's what historians are thinking of. It makes a lot of sense to me, that interpretation. That's why I roll with it. But of course, they've also had other ventures as well, which I mentioned already. And then finally, just one other aspect of this is that this whole drive to unify the country, to make it one thing. And I mentioned this about Republicans, even the ones who weren't radicals, blame the war on the United States not being unified enough. It wasn't one single economy. They wanted one type of economy, one industrialized economy for the entire country. They wanted to have one, a consolidated national state. The United States had not had that really, where there's one, you had a federal government, but it was very limited by what the states did. The Civil War got rid of that, for good or ill. And again, they don't actually act on this in the period after the Civil War into the 19th century, but in the 20th century, they will make good on that. Whereas the federal government is totally dominant over the states, definitely by the 1960s. But this is happening elsewhere in the Western world. Revolutions of Western Europe in the 19th century spurred the growth of centralized states, and for a brief time, the United States had that in Reconstruction. And this process whereby you subordinate older local communities, their beliefs, their customs, to a new national identity, kind of like they were trying to do in Reconstruction, happens in places like the German Empire. If you don't know what the German Empire is, Germany doesn't become a modern, as a nation state, doesn't exist until 1871. Germany was a name for a loose collection of states that existed for a long, long time. until they're united under Prussian leadership in 1871. They're given a modern nation state. And so Reconstruction's kind of part of that process too with the United States, where you have all these struggles for unity, but also trying to make things equal. And then the tragedy of African Americans having to suffer like they do in Reconstruction and afterwards. And so that is my lecture on Reconstruction. Again, we'll talk about some of this in our discussion. You can talk about, one good thing to talk about is, why did Reconstruction fail? Could it have succeeded? Those sorts of things are all what if questions are always good to ask for these types of events, and to get into them and think about them, and think about what legacy this might have for us to today as well. What relevance, maybe if at all, maybe things have changed too much. We don't have a direct connection to this, but we're doing that stuff in our discussion. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you in class.